And then what happened was that, I mean, the goal, because I made it available on the internet, suddenly other people came in, and other people's goals also became kind of the goal of the community. And it's not even one goal, it's like many small sub-goals that depending on who you ask, you'll get different answers. It's certainly meant to be, these days, a viable alternative to just about anything. That's not saying that it's necessarily the best alternative for everything, but it's certainly meant to push the limits on what you can do with computers. And depending on what you're up to, it may be the best alternative, or it may be completely non-viable.
Going back to 91, the situation
Right.
of Minix and Linux.
So in 91, basically for most of 91, I was the only user. And Minix came in there too, because I was initially using Minix to develop Linux on.
Where did Minix come from?
Minix came from Free University in Amsterdam. It was a teaching tool. And partly because it was a teaching tool, and partly because it was trying to teach specific things that a lot of people actually disagree with, it had a lot of limitations. But it was, the reason I used it was the closest I could get to Unix initially. So it started out as a kind of platform for doing Linux development, and then in 92 what happened was that the new Linux users tended to be Minix users, because that was the kind of community that I was going after. I mean, the kind of people who were interested in operating systems but couldn't afford or get a hold of commercial Unix. So the Minix users groups were good places to find people with the specific kinds of issues that I wanted to have brought out in Linux. So Minix was kind of a growing base for Linux in that sense.
Now, who was the leading kind of advocate or developer of Minix, and was there a difference in kind of vision between what you were doing with Linux and what was being done with Minix?
By the time I started doing Linux, Minix had not been actively developed for a few years. And basically there were a lot of people on the net doing small projects with Minix, but because of the nature of the copyright with Minix, you couldn't really grow a large project. Like, you couldn't make it grow dynamically the way Linux ended up growing. So Minix to some degree was fairly stagnant. There were a few interesting patches around, and that was one of the reasons why it was then so easy to get the people who were interested in operating systems to see that Linux was the more dynamic. There was all these new development going on, and that was very interesting to technical people. Andy Tannenbaum wrote the Minix book and wrote a lot of the Minix code, and had a very strong influence on how Minix worked. And he, several years later, released the next version of Minix 2. So there was some maintenance going on, but there wasn't that much contact. I mean, there was some contact, and people have probably seen the internet wars that flamed up occasionally between the Minix users and the Linux users.
Can you describe those exactly? What was the differing point there?
Most of the different points were fairly technical. I mean, at that point in time, most users were very specifically technical users who knew what operating systems were supposed to work like. And a lot of them were from university backgrounds. So for that reasons, a lot of the kind of discussions were about fairly abstract points, where Minix was trying to be what's called a microkernel in the kind of OS architecture discussions, and Linux was taking a much more pragmatic approach, much more, hey, this approach has been used, it works, we don't need a microkernel, and in fact microkernels have a lot of purely theoretical problems that aren't necessarily even worth fighting about. So there was this kind of academic tension between the two, and obviously because there was a lot of contact points, because a lot of users used actually both Linux and Minix at the time, that tension was then shown in the news groups as fairly heated discussions at times. So the basic idea behind a microkernel is that you want to make the complete system, you make it up of small pieces of the puzzle, and you make each piece as simple as you can. And the idea being that something that is simple is easy to maintain and doesn't break very easily. And the argument against that is that when you make a lot of small, simple pieces, the pieces themselves may be simple, but the system, the dynamics of the systems are very complex. And the prime example of that is the human brain, where there's a lot of very simple pieces, but nobody has ever been able to figure out how the dynamics of the system actually works. And the same holds true in operating system too, even when the pieces aren't quite as many. So there's this philosophical discussion whether should you go for one OS that doesn't have that much dynamics in communication with different parts of the system, or should you go with lots of small microkernel issues where you have to do a lot of communication between the two. And the issue certainly hasn't been solved, although in practice all kind of production use operating systems are of the monolithic kind.
So back to kind of the development model of Linux. How would you describe that?
The best description is probably to think of how the information flows and what the kind of relationships between people are. And the Linux model it's not really chaotic, but it's more of a kind of network of people where nobody has kind of absolute control. There's nobody at the top who says that this is how things are going to be. It's more like a lot of people with connections to other people they know, more of a kind of social network. And then obviously certain people tend to be more central in the sense that they know more people and they know more of the central people. But even I don't have control of how development is done in a very, very real sense, because I have no way of telling people that you have to do it this way, because otherwise what could I do, right? I don't have any other authority than kind of a moral and technical lead person that people know how I work and know how I think and trust me for that. And then in a traditional company, you always have a hierarchy of people, and you have somebody who's supposed to give you the direction you're going in, and the others are supposed to just follow the leader. And the dynamics are very different in the two systems.
So what would you describe as the kind of the benefit and at the same time kind of the downside of more of the bizarre model?
The downside is maybe that it's kind of more organic and amorphous, that it's harder to see a clear direction from the outside in particular. And that direction really comes from the sum of all these small nodes that are moving in some general direction, right? But it's not clear cut. And that means that the motivation to some degree has to come from within the project itself, which is why this has worked so very well for certain kinds of technical projects where the motivation really is the project itself, and everybody is pretty much on the same page on what the general direction should be. So the advantage when this works, and I mean it does work in a lot of projects, not that just Linux, is that the whole kind of structure is so much more robust. There is no single point of failure. Also, there's the potential to do many different directions at the same time. A company cannot afford to go in tens of thousands of different directions at the same time, because that just does not work. But if you have this kind of more amorphous network of people, it's okay to have everybody work in a slightly different direction, and you kind of expand to fill the whole kind of space of potential for the project. which means that, for example, inside Linux, we've seen a lot of these kind of niche areas getting filled up, areas that nobody would have ever gone after as a commercial project because it was so obviously a niche area. But what happens is that after that niche is filled, people notice that there is a kind of good symbiosis between the niche and the rest of the system, and it makes the whole stronger.
Now, what do you see? Do you see any advantage though in the cathedral model, as opposed to the model that the Linux has kind of evolved on?
I think the cathedral model kind of works very well when the project doesn't inherently have a very clear motivational factor, when it doesn't have a very clear direction, and often when you need to do a lot of grunt work, and you need to have some strong person that just says that you and you do the grunt work, because if you don't, you won't get that next paycheck. And you see that in the Linux area too. If you look at the technical side and the technical development, that works with this networked scenario. But then when you look at the commercial Linux companies, a lot of what they are doing is support and just maintaining a database of issues with other vendors, and a lot of this grunt work that is needed for a kind of well-functioning system. And at the same time, that is something where you're going to have a very hard time finding people motivating themselves to do it.
So what motivates the people that work on Linux that aren't being directed from the top down? What's their motivation?
Usually it's just personal interest. It started out with a lot of, my personal interest in making an operating system. A lot of other people turned out to be very personally interested in how an operating system works. It's a kind of exciting piece of software from a computer science standpoint because it's so different from any other program. But especially these days, the motivational factors are usually that you want to do something special. And in order to get around to doing that, you then improve some area of the OS so that you have better support for the program you're doing. I've had very little contact with, I met all of the original Unix people. We've gone to the same conferences, but at the same time, they did Unix, it's 30 years ago now, and have basically lost interest and moved on to something else. So there's been some discussion about the issues, but most of it has actually been more social than anything else.
What year was Unix created?
I think it was 69.
What year were you born?
69.
69.
So, it may not be exactly 69, but I'm pretty much the same age as Unix, yes.
What prevents Linux from fragmenting? If it's in the kind of the bazaar model, you don't control it exclusively, it's everyone kind of contributes to it. What prevents it from being all sorts of different incompatible flavors?
Right. I've been counting 3 reasons for it. One of the main reasons is just a psychological one. People have seen Unix fragment and nobody wants to do it again. The reason Unix fragmented was that there were all these compelling marketing advantages to having your own version of Unix. And you could always one-up the competition saying that, hey, look at what cool features we have. And that made the Unix market fragment. On the Linux side, the marketing advantages are much weaker, because if any marketing person would say that, hey, we could do this cool incompatible feature, everybody else would just jump on him and say, no, we did that with Unix and it did not work. The other reason is just the copyright, which says, for example, that let's say that SUSE in Europe decides that they will add this very cool feature in order to take the market completely away from Red Hat, whatever. I mean, and they do that, and it's a huge market success. The copyright license says that under those circumstances, there's nothing stopping Red Hat or anybody else from just copying the feature and putting into their version of Linux as well, and suddenly it's an even playing field again. So that's kind of fundamentally keeps it from fragmenting. And just the third reason is just a lot of software companies, especially now that Linux has been more commercialized, you're seeing these commercial Linux binary distributions for Oracle, for Adobe Acrobat. I mean, a lot of these traditional programs that everybody wants to run, and nobody's willing to risk not running those. So what happened was that the original Linux license wasn't actually the GPL. The original Linux license was something which said that you can do whatever you want with this, as long as when you copy it, you cannot charge any money for it, and you have to make sources available under the same license. And what happened was that, especially the no money clause, resulted in a lot of people who would have been willing and wanted to make Linux distributions initially on floppies and stuff like that, but they could not, I mean, they did not want to actually pay for the floppies themselves in order to give them to their friends and at users groups and meetings like that. So people started asking me, could I come up with an alternate license that wasn't quite as black and white, that said that it's okay to charge a nominal fee, for example. And my issue with that was that, okay, what do you consider nominal? And I decided that, hey, there's absolutely no way you can limit the amount of money, and you probably shouldn't even try. And as a result, I decided that, hey, there was this GPL that I knew of, and I used a lot of programs that were under the GPL. So I just decided that, hey, I will use the GPL for Linux as the license for the copying conditions. And what happened was that I came up with this, in my opinion, great name, which was Freaks. Free, but also freak, and then the X again, right? And people quite correctly thought that Freaks was a really bad name. So Linux ended up being called Linux just because it defaulted to it, and I'm just as happy it's not called Freaks and I have to explain the Freaks angle every time.
So, why did you choose the penguin as the mascot?
There is no why. There is more of we had to have a logo, and I did not want to have a boring corporate kind of stylized traditional logo that big corporations tend to like. I wanted to have something fun and friendly, and that tends to mean that you want to have a furry animal, right? And the penguin was just an animal. It may not have fur, but almost. And I just like them, so it happened.
So, is there in any way that the penguin or its activities or anything is analogous to the nature of Linux and the open source movement? It's just completely that's what you liked, and there's no other...
It's a bird. It can't even fly. I mean, it is a really good swimmer, but how does that tie into operating systems? No. It's just that I liked it.
Now, with the GPL, with Linux being under the general public license, and you make any changes to the source code, you have to permit someone else to copy those. And how does that affect commercial vendors who want to, say, write software applications? Does this prevent them from having proprietary applications, or what's the relationship there?
For example, when it comes to Linux itself, the fact that Linux is GPL'd does not have any impact at all on user-level applications that are using Linux, because it only really impacts people who change Linux, the kernel, the operating system, and people who are just using it are just using it. And copyright, really, as the name says, is an issue of copying and making those copies and modifications available to others. It's not about using. What happens is that if you are doing commercial software for Linux, you may be careful that you aren't using any other part that is GPL that might infringe on what you're doing. So you need to be careful that you're not using somebody else's work outside the kernel. But in general, there's absolutely no clash between the two.
So if I write a computer game for the Linux operating system,
it does not need to be open source. And I mean, this happens all the time. There's a number of commercial applications that are available as binaries only.
The basic, back to kind of the Linux development model, basically, from what I understand, there's a core kind of almost committee that decides what's the official version, official patches. Can you briefly describe who that is and how that works?
Well, briefly, it's me. The definition of official in the Linux community is something that I have blessed, right, and put out on. In practice, there's obviously a lot of people who influence me. It's not a core team in the sense that you don't have voting rights. The way you influence me is by being right, or just showing yourself to have a firm grasp of what's going on. And after some time, there's been a lot of people who I trust, and when they give me opinions, I take those opinions and use them to guide what I'm doing. So there is a lot of people who kind of become the inner circle, but it's...
Who are some of those people?
Alan Cox, David Miller, Stephen Tweedy, Andrea Ankangeli. I mean, there's a number of them. I think I've met most of them. Uh-huh. But right now, for example, about half of them are in Europe, or at least outside the US. And I meet them maybe once a year. And at the same time, I tend to be in email contact with them, maybe on average once a day.
Now, you may not write software, but maybe you cook. And if you cook, you probably use recipes, which means you probably change recipes sometimes, and you probably share recipes with other people. And sometimes you pass along your changed version of a recipe. People may like that better than the version you got, or they may not. They have a choice. And so in this way, people who cook form a community. The purpose of free software is to enable people who use computers to have a similar community, like the community that I belonged to in the 1970s. That's what the free software movement is all about. And that's the purpose of the GNU project, because when we started, it's as if you were a cook, but all the recipes you could ever get came with non-disclosure agreements, and you were being forced to promise you'd never share them with your friends who cook. And if you did share, they would call you a pirate and put you in jail. Now, in that situation, what would we have to do? People who are good cooks would have to get together and make new recipes and share them so that we could have a community, so that we could get free of the domination of the people who own the recipes. Well, in the software world, what could we do? We good programmers get together and write a whole spectrum of free software so that everybody can have a community while using software. The community is going to face problems from existing monopolistic laws and from new ones that the software owners are trying to enact. One of the problems we face now is when features or software techniques are patented, which makes it illegal for us to provide them. And we've demonstrated we can produce a broad spectrum of free software, but if it's illegal for us to do a job, then we can't do it. And this is getting to be a bigger and bigger problem, especially lately for the World Wide Web. So eventually, I believe it's going to be necessary for the millions of users of free software of the GNU/Linux operating system to organize politically and demand an exemption from patent law for software, or at least for free software. A couple of years ago, Congress passed a law exempting surgical procedures from patent law. So they can certainly do it for software. We just have to put on the pressure. Now, additional laws are being considered now to impose new monopolies on the public. For example, one proposed law called UCITA is proposed for all states to pass, and this will put many new restrictions on the users of proprietary software, mostly which won't affect users of free software, but one thing will, and that is prohibitions on reverse engineering, which means looking at a program, studying how it works, and figuring out what the techniques are so you can use those techniques yourself. Now, this is something that's legitimate and normal practice, always has been, to reverse engineer some piece of equipment and figure out how it works. But of course, the owners of software don't want us to be able to do this, and so that's one benefit they will get if they get their law through. Another thing that they're proposing is to have monopolies on collections of facts. Now, this is totally unprecedented in the US. There has never been a situation where facts that are public knowledge can nonetheless be restricted so that you're not allowed to tell them to other people, publish them, essentially. But that's what they will do with new laws creating monopolies on the use of information obtained from electronic databases. And imagine if it were illegal to publish baseball scores and statistics, because they all come out of an electronic database, you know, that's how they keep the score at the game. That's one of the things that one of these laws would do. But in the long run, though, we face an even bigger challenge, because copyright law was designed to go with the printing press. It fit naturally with the printing press. It was a restriction on publishers and authors. It didn't restrict anything that readers could do. But copyright doesn't fit computers and computer networks. And so there are only two possibilities: either relax it enough so that it fits comfortably, or turn it into a totalitarian regime and enforce it with an information police that intrudes everywhere. Well, you can guess what the owners of information, the media companies, the publishers want to do. They want to impose their restrictions on everyone, everywhere. And that's what they've been doing, because the public basically ignores the issue, and they can pass so far whatever laws they've wanted. If you look at the measures that the Soviet Union used to control illegal copying, all of those measures are in use today, or at least proposed by the administration in the US.
What about piracy, though?
Well, piracy is what the owners of information like to call sharing with your friends. I reject that term. I don't believe that we should call it piracy when people help their neighbors, when they teach each other useful information. Open source is basically another name for free software, but the open source movement is very different from the free software movement. We do almost the same thing, and we actually work together on practical projects, but the reasons are totally different. Open source, they talk about practical benefits from having this kind of cooperation. You can develop reliable software, powerful software. And I agree with them. I agree with that as far as it goes. But what they never talk about is freedom and the importance of having a community, of being free to participate in a community when you want to. Whereas for me, and for the free software movement, that is the most important part. It's the kind of life we can have if we are permitted to cooperate with each other. They avoid mentioning that because their strategy is to win support from business executives. And they believe, rightly or wrongly, that business executives will be turned off by talking about freedom and community. So they focus solely on the practical benefits. And they have succeeded in winning the support of some businesses. But I believe that while they do that, it's necessary to have other people talking about freedom, spreading the idea, the awareness that there's an issue of freedom at stake here, so that we will eventually be able to resist the laws to take away our freedom. I think that it's unfortunate for the community that they're not aware of the role played by the GNU Project, because you don't find this talk of freedom associated with the name Linux. And that means we're getting millions of users coming into our community, and we're not teaching them the civics of our community. And that means they're not going to be prepared to lobby to preserve their freedom when new laws are proposed to take it away. And that puts our community's long-term existence at a certain amount of additional risk. It's going to take a great effort to prevail over those who want to control and restrict us and divide us. We're going to have to work. And in order for people to work, they have to see something more at stake beyond convenience. So it's vital for people to know that there's an issue of freedom at stake for them too. And they will find that out if they look at what the GNU Project did and why. Well, it's ironic for the Free Software Foundation, which was founded in 1985 to promote the free software movement and develop GNU, to get an award named after Linus Torvalds, who came in at the end and did the last step of the job. It was an important part of the job, but we did set the goal and do the biggest part of the job. We did the beginning parts of the job back when everyone was saying that we would never get there.
Sure. So my name is Brian Behlendorf. I'm co-founder and chief technology officer of Collab.net, and I'm also president of the Apache Software Foundation. How I got involved in free software? Well, I guess I would go back initially to the founding of Apache, the Apache Software Project, where in 1995 I was the chief engineer at Hotwired and was working on a website that had required some things that websites hadn't needed to do until that point. So in January of 1995, I was chief engineer at Hotwired. Hotwired was one of the first publishing websites on the internet, actually. And one of the things we needed to do was build a password-based system for people to be able to come in and tailor the site to their interests and post information and things like that. And the web server that we were using at the time, the NCSA server, didn't really support passwords all that well. So I had implemented some patches to actually make that a bit more usable and effective and such. And there were some other changes that I had made for some various speed and security things. Other people had also been working on some patches for related things like that. And there was a community of people actually focused over the internet, sharing over email the different patches that we had made, what are called patches, to the source code of the NCSA web server. And we were trading them around like baseball cards and decided that rather than trying to lay them one on top of the other and worry about all the complexity issues that happened when you do that, that it would be actually more efficient for us to work together on a common kind of piece of software that was built on top of the NCSA web server. And so the group of us formed a mailing list that I hosted on a hobbyist machine that I was hosting at Wired at the time, and started talking about what would we want to do, what are the kinds of things that we could build into this, started collecting together patches that other people had written, started making some releases, first on our own website and then using a tool called CVS to actually distribute the versioning of developing the software. And over time, it just evolved from what, a simple small mailing list to what is now a foundation, essentially a nonprofit organization that is in charge of a number of different server-based open source software development projects. The name Apache came about by those of us who were starting it, trying to decide how we were going to call it, what name we were going to give it, and generally thinking there was too much web this and spider that and hyper this or whatever. So I suggested the name Apache, mainly because it connotated to me a sense of strength and a sense of independence that I thought was important and kind of cool. Somebody else in the UK actually picked up on it and said, "Oh, that's a very good pun." I said, "A pun? You know, what's punny about it?" And they said, "Well, it's a patchy server," so that's why the name stuck. So the NCSA server, which is what we built on top of, ran on most of the major forms of Unix at the time: Solaris, Linux, AIX, HPUX, etc. And so we continued that trend, and actually, the software as it was written was so simple that it could be ported with a relative amount of ease to other operating systems as well. So we now have a port on NT, for example. There's a port that runs on the Amiga and the OS2. Someone ported it to the Mac. I mean, there's a lot of different places that it runs on. It would probably run best on Linux and on FreeBSD. And the reason is the communities around those operating systems are also the communities that contribute the most back to Apache, right?
Was Apache attractive to ISPs because of Linux, or was Linux attractive to ISPs because of Apache?
Well, it's like the answer to the chicken and egg question, which is neither both evolve simultaneously, right? It was a function of good timing. It was a function of the fact that the internet as a whole was starting to take off, that people needed web servers, that it was really a broad-based